What's going on, everyone? In this video, I'm going to be talking about the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K Pro, which from here on out, I'm just gonna call it the 6K Pro because number one, well, I think we can all agree, number one, that's a mouthful to say, and number two, this is definitely not a pocket camera by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, I think this is more of an evolution of the original cinema camera, the 2.5K one, form factor wise and everything, much more akin to that than a pocket camera. So anyways, I've had this pocket camera for, I don't know, 6 or 7 weeks or so, and in that time, I have been able to kind of use it with the intended purposes that I had for it, which was a B camera to my Ursa G2, also like a kind of a doco style camera that kind of be, you know, really low key and, you know, not bring a lot of attention like I would with a Ursa G2 and the Easy Rig and all that kind of stuff, getting B-roll around town for story videos or whatnot, and then also travel, you know, using this as my travel cam, which is a fantastic little travel camera. Now this video probably is going to be pretty long, so what I've done is I've added little chapter markers down in the description below so you can kind of skip ahead to whatever topic that might be more relevant to you or to whatever you want to know. But if you want to stick around and watch the entire video and hang out with me, then I would really appreciate it. And we can go ahead and get into this. So first of all, let's actually look at some footage from this thing, and then we'll kind of get into the nitty-gritty details of this camera. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that. Obviously, all that was shot on this camera, pretty much all handheld, just for like travel and stuff. I mean, I've shot like interviews and stuff, but that's like way less exciting to look at than, you know, cool footage of the mountains and stuff. So anyways, the Pocket 6K Pro, what is new with this camera compared to the original Pocket 6K? Well, first of all, I mean, it's pretty much all hardware related. I mean, everything else, software like the menu system, the sensor, the image, frame rates, all that stuff is the same as the original Pocket 6K. Pretty much everything that has changed has to do with hardware. And right off the bat, when you pull this out of the box, it is definitely a chunkier, heavier camera than the original Pocket 6K, but that's because there is a lot more packed into this hardware related than the original 6K Pro. Notably, the biggest feature probably is the internal ND system that we have on this camera that we'll talk about here in a minute. We also here have on the top an optional port to be able to put an EVF on there, which is an optional purchase. Right now, I think it's $495 US. You just unscrew the cap of this and then install the EVF to be able to use for a third point of contact or whatever the case may be. On this side, we have an additional mini XLR port, which is really awesome. So you can run two microphones into the camera that both require phantom power, which is really awesome. And then you also have all the other same IO ports that you have from the original 6K. And then the next addition here we have on the back, obviously we have the buttons up here, which allow you to change the ND filters, which is really nice. It's like in the perfect location to be able to change between your ND filters. Super awesome, great location for the buttons there. And then obviously another big selling point of this camera is the fact that it has an articulating screen, which I still have the little 6 weeks and I've still had this on. Whoa, that looks so fresh and so clean. Anyways, otherwise, it all looks the same. It's all the same as the Pocket 6K original one. You have the same buttons here, high frame rate button, all that kind of good stuff. And on the bottom, we have a couple new design features as well. First of all, we have a new battery tray, battery door, because we're using new batteries, the NPF 550, 570 batteries. And this is the battery that it ships with lasts a really long time. We'll get into that here and there as well. And lastly, I guess the last thing I'll talk about, I'm really excited. It's like one of the things I was most excited about with this camera were these two little tripod mounting points. Now we have two instead of just the one. And the reason why this is so awesome is because if you screw both of these in, there's no chance of this tripod plate sliding or backing out or anything like that. It just makes it much more secure. So whether you're putting it on a rail system or a tripod or a gimbal or whatever the case may be, no more issues with it pivoting or swiveling around or anything like that. But as I said, from an image standpoint, software, menu system, all that is the same. It's identical to the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 6K. Still has the same 6K resolution, up to 50 frames per second. All the frame rates and stuff are exactly the same dynamic range, all that kind of good stuff. So if you want to know more about that, there are tons of videos on the original Pocket 6K talking about all the good things about that sensor and stuff. But what I want to talk about in this video really are the hardware improvements that really, in my opinion, I think make it worth the premium price over the Pocket 6K, which is, I know $500 is not a little bit of money, but relatively speaking, for $500, you're getting an additional articulating screen, built-in NDs, the option of having an EVF, better battery life, and all that kind of good stuff, and another mini XLR port. So really huge, and kind of makes this this thing is like pretty much ready to go right out of the box. Like you don't need to really rig this thing up. At least I don't. That's my intended use. I don't rig this thing up. So anyways, more on that a little bit later. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the things that in more detail that are new about this camera. So let's talk about first about the internal NDs. So we have 2, 4, and 6 stops of ND, which is really nice. For the most part, that covers pretty much all shooting scenarios that you need, unless you're out in bright sunny daylight shooting at f1.2, then maybe an 8th stop of ND would be really helpful. However, I personally just not have run into really any situation where I need an extra 2 stops of ND over 6 stops. So yeah, really good there. And as I mentioned earlier, to be able to change the NDs, you just use these 2 buttons to toggle between the different ND settings. Now the NDs in here are IR NDs, very similar, maybe even the same IR NDs found on the Ursa Mini Pro G2. And the IR NDs, essentially what the intended use for IR NDs is basically when you crank up ND in the camera, those neutral density filters do not cut out the infrared light spectrum, which most digital camera sensors are very prone to. Many digital camera sensors have built-in IR filtration, and so it's really nice to have that in here. But how good are these IR NDs actually? Because what's really important with IR NDs, with NDs in general, is to have minimal color shift and IR NDs to actually cut infrared light, so you don't have infrared contamination. So I did a couple of tests, some indoor, some outdoor, to kind of see how these NDs performed. And the indoor one we'll take a look at right now, and I just used a Tungsten ATC Source 4 PAR light to kind of light up a couple of different things that I know are prone to show IR contamination. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. All right, so this first test, you can see here, what I've done is, like I said, I used an ETC Source 4 PAR with a few items that I knew that would be prone to IR contamination and to show the color shift. like this little piece of paper and the gray card and all that kind of stuff. So if you look at the screen, there are 4 images. The left side is without any extra IR cut, and the right side is with IR cut using a Hoya UV IR cut filter. And then from top to bottom, we have 0 stops at the top and 6 stops down at the bottom. So you can kind of get a frame of reference, and this is gonna follow the same methodology with the rest of the test. All right, so as you can see from the tungsten light, without any IR cut filter, even at 0 stops, we're getting IR contamination. And with the IR cut filter on the right side, you can see it's cleaned up, and you can see that really on the tripod bag and the black part, the black framing of that gray card. And the other thing I want to show is there is a color shift between 0 stops and 6 stops. And you actually get a color shift between 2 and 4 stops as well, but 6 stops is definitely the most extreme. So I just wanted to show you what that looks like. And you can kind of see that on that white piece of paper, and overall, it definitely shifts a little bit more towards magenta and blue. And I want to mention that the white balance has not been adjusted at all on any of these shots, and going forward in other shots, all the white balance settings are exactly the same. But the only difference is using ND and IR cut filters. Those are the only variables. All right, and as I said earlier, the internal NDs on the Pocket 6K Pro, I said might be the same or very similar to those found on the Ursa G2. And the reason why I say that is because I conducted the same test with the Ursa G2 as I did with the Pocket 6K Pro. And as you can see here, the results are very similar. There's IR contamination without any stops of ND, and then as soon as we put on the IR cut, it cleans up that image a lot more. And we're also seeing a color shift with the NDs at 6 stops of ND. All right, so next up is just another test in the same room. This is just kind of have a more of a talking head setup, showing skin tones and all that kind of stuff. Now, the only difference here is I put some diffusion in front of the light just to soften it a little bit so it doesn't look as harsh on my skin. So as you can see, again, IR contamination is present in the image, and it's most notable in my hat and in my jacket. You can see that green is kind of a little bit more yellow looking without IR cut. And the other thing you can see is skin tones are slightly affected, but in my opinion, that is pretty minimal considering with the IR cut, it cleans up those blacks and the IR contamination. So in my opinion, I don't really see that as that big of an issue. All right, in my next test, I used the same methodology. Now, this isn't like super scientific. I mean, I just went outside into direct sunlight to kind of see how the sensor reacts to IR contamination in direct sunlight. So as you can see, it behaves pretty much the same as my test with tungsten light. IR contamination is present even without ND, as well as there is a color shift with ND6. So if you look at that tripod bag, you can see that there is IR contamination even at 0 stops of ND. And when we add 6 stops of ND, you can definitely see that there's a color shift towards kind of blue and magenta. And as I said earlier, you still get these color shifts at 2 and 4 stops, but 6 stops is definitely the most pronounced color shift. But the color shift is actually pretty easy to correct. So here you can see at the top, I have the 0 stops ND with IR cut, and below you can see the same shot with on the left as it comes out of the camera, and then on the right you can see it's corrected. And if you compare that from the shot with 0 stops ND, it's pretty much identical, and it's super quick to correct. So is this ND shift, the color shift, is this really an issue? Well, it is, but you're gonna pretty much find that any ND system out there, especially variable ND systems, which I would argue that they are the closest match to convenience and versatility to the internal NDs. And with variable NDs, you're gonna get some pretty nasty color shifts as well. In fact, I have the Polar Pro Peter McKinnon 2 to 5 stop variable ND filter, as well as a Tiffin variable ND filter. And as you can see here, you get really nasty color shifts towards green, pretty much the opposite way with those ND filters. So between the color shift of the internal NDs and the variable NDs, I would say the variable NDs have a much worse color shift than the internal NDs. This is just my preference. This is just what I think. So in my opinion, I think I would much rather use the internal NDs as opposed to screwing on variable NDs and all that kind of stuff. Now, that doesn't get away from the need to use IR cut. Now, the shots you just looked at had a Hoya UV IR cut filter in front of it. And based on my test, it shows that even at 0 stops ND, we're still getting IR contamination. So if you don't want to have IR contamination in your footage, then you're probably gonna need to use an IR cut filter. Now, if you don't like the color shift of the internal NDs and you wanna have minimal color shift with external NDs, then you're gonna have to not use something like a variable ND system and use individual NDs, like something like that of a Nisi or something like that. And even with those, you're gonna still need to use a clear IR cut filter if you don't want to have IR contamination in front of your lens, maybe using a matte box or something like that. And then anytime you add NDs, you're gonna need to use IR NDs, like I said, like that of Nisi. Now, those are fantastic ND filters. However, they can be really expensive. And you gotta kind of weigh what's more important to you. Do you want the versatility and the quickness of the internal NDs and correct that little shift in post? Or do you wanna have no shift at all and have to deal with using external NDs and stuff? And if you wanna use external NDs, then I wouldn't recommend getting this camera for that purpose. I think the Pocket 6K Original might be a better option for you. For my workflow, I definitely prefer to have the internal NDs and just screw on a IR cut filter on front of the lens and deal with that correction in post. Or you can just set up an auto white balance or white balance your gray card with your 6 stops or 4 stops or 2 stops of ND and white balance it that way before you even roll. So either way, I think the ND shift is not a huge deal, at least for me personally, but that's something that you need to consider. And based on these tests, I think there is definitely evidence that there is a shift and there is IR contamination. So I think that's something that you definitely need to consider when purchasing this camera. All right, so that was really long-winded and I apologize for that, but the NDs were like kind of a hot topic right when this camera came out, and everybody was kind of talking about the shift and all that kind of stuff and the IR contamination. So I figured I would just make a test, kind of show you what I found and give you my thoughts on it. But that being said, I think I've kind of spoken my piece about it, so let's move on to monitoring options. So first of all, the new addition right here is at the top. You can use an optional EVF, which is $495, at least at the time of recording this. And basically what you can do is you can unscrew this little thread right here, this little screw right here, this cap comes off and you can attach the EVF to it, which is great for a third point of contact especially. And I would say it's great for shooting out in bright sunlight because you may not be able to see your monitor, but that's just not the case because now we have this monitor right here, which is, in my opinion, even if NDs are an issue to you, like if you want to run external NDs and all that kind of stuff, like this still might be worth that $500 premium over the 6K because number one, it articulates, and number two, it is really freaking bright. It's a 1500 nit HDR monitor, and it is daylight viewable. I was filming out in Moab in the desert and had no problem seeing this, seeing the monitor or what I was recording at all, pulling focus, no problem, all that kind of good stuff. Even wearing sunglasses, yeah, this is super bright. So if the NDs are an issue, this monitor right here might be worth the premium because now that it articulates, I really see no reason to run an external monitor on top of the camera. The only time I would maybe run an external monitor on top of the camera is my Atomos Ninja 5 just to get backup ProRes recordings. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit of what I think could be improved. So yeah, those are the two features, monitoring features that have been improved. Obviously, you still have your HDMI here to run a monitor out if you need to. All right, now let's move on to powering this camera. We have a couple of different powering options with this camera. As I mentioned earlier, we now have the Sony NPF style 570 batteries, and the camera ships with one of these, which is a really high quality battery, by the way. So I actually did a test, and at 100% brightness on the screen, recording at 6K resolution at 12:1 compression and 24 frames per second, I got a record time of 55 minutes and like 30 seconds or something like that. Now, I use these batteries as well. I got these off Amazon, and these are like the highest capacity ones I could find. And these are 22.2 watt hours. And to my surprise, I only got about 33 minutes of runtime, and I tested on both of these batteries, and I have a handful of other different batteries, and I'm getting very similar results. So basically what this tells me is the Blackmagic Design sourced some really high quality lithium ion batteries for their cameras. So if consistency with runtime and longer runtime is most important to you, I would recommend getting the Blackmagic branded NPF style batteries for the camera. But great thing, I'm really glad that they upgraded to this battery as opposed to the LPE6 battery, because these are much more useful for many different applications, not just powering camera, but a lot of monitors and wireless transmission systems and stuff run off these batteries, and they are very, very easy to find. So really happy about the battery and the battery life. 55 minutes is pretty awesome. Now this wasn't like a control, like in my living room, it was 65 degrees in the room, it's like perfect conditions. So your mileage is definitely gonna vary depending on the shooting conditions you're in. If you're in really cold weather, probably not gonna last as long. So moving on to a more battery related powering options, we have now a battery grip option that we can get. That's also an optional purchase. And basically you gotta take this little plate off, and instead of powering the camera, like the battery grip, even like on the old pocket camera, or like what you find with like the R5, Canon R5, or any other DSLR or something, where the battery grip kind of slides into here. Instead, you keep this battery in here, and you have these little pins right here that allow you basically to connect the battery grip, and it sends power through these little pins. So you have basically 3 batteries now, is essentially what you're getting. And these 2 batteries that you have in the battery grip right here are essentially what they're doing is they're charging this battery the entire time. So you technically can hot swap if you want to, which is really nice. Now I wouldn't recommend doing that during like an interview or something, especially if you only have one camera running, because you're definitely going to notice that shake. However, if you cut to your B cam or something, you can use that shot while you're swapping out batteries. So it's really nice there. I don't currently have the battery grip, but I may end up getting one in the future, especially if I have a project where I'm going to be, following someone around all day, maybe filming a hunt or whatever the case may be. Who knows? But it's great to have that option to power the camera that way. And then lastly, powering the camera via the AC adapter, via mains power. I love this feature, not only the fact that it's a locking cable, but the fact that it also charges the battery while you're powering the camera. It's really awesome. So if the power goes out or something during an interview for whatever reason, you're still rolling. Your camera doesn't just turn off and die because you have an internal battery that's being charged the entire time. Wow, this review is all over the place, but let's go ahead and wrap up. That's pretty much wraps up the features that I want to talk about. So now let's talk about a couple of things that I like about this camera, and a couple of things where I think there might be some missed opportunities, hardware related, and then maybe some possible improvements. Trying to stay positive here, some possible improvements that we can get maybe via firmware update. All right, so first up is image quality of this camera, and I mean that is a no-brainer. It's no surprise this camera has a beautiful, beautiful image. The sensor out of this thing is awesome. It claimed 13 stops of dynamic range. I haven't done any like lab tests or anything, but I have no reason to doubt that dynamic range. But yeah, dynamic range is awesome. And if you read the manual, you see like the little ISO chart, and you'll see that as you go up in ISO from 0 to 1000 and even up, you start getting more highlight detail as you go up in ISO. So like at 800 ISO, this is like kind of the sweet spot for this camera for outdoor shooting, to get a lot of highlight detail and shadow detail as well. Now there is, in the shadows, there is a lot of chroma noise. You're definitely gonna have to use some chroma noise reduction in post to clean that up, but otherwise the image looks absolutely stunning. The highlight roll off is really, really pleasing. Obviously, I love everything new that we just talked about, the NDs, the screen, the additional XLR, all that kind of stuff. I definitely love that. The menu system, still love that. That hasn't changed from any of the Blackmagic cameras. I mean, even like the first menu system that Blackmagic had on the original cinema camera was already awesome. And then like one of my favorite features of these cameras is this little button right here, especially for running gun stuff and quick event shooting and stuff. To be able to switch between standard frame rate and high frame rate really quickly is such an awesome little feature. I love having that on my Ursa, and I wish every camera had that because it is such a useful little feature. All right, now let's talk about some missed opportunities with this camera, and I think there are some missed opportunities, especially with hardware. And the first thing has to do with this right here. We have just HDMI. Now, this being a Pro model, has Pro in the name, I really would have expected this to have given us SDI output either instead of HDMI, or even if they would have just not given us another XLR in and just given us SDI out to have two ways to send a signal out would be really helpful. It's really helpful for sending a signal out on a wireless transmission system or whatever, or maybe even giving us like a time code or gen lock or something. That would have also been extremely handy to have, especially for live productions and broadcasts and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that was kind of a missed opportunity, especially this being called a Pro model. I understand that the target market may not have really needed gen lock and all that stuff, but that would have been super handy to have, maybe even instead of the second XLR input. The other thing is the EF mount. It's really loose, just like with the original Pocket 6K and even the Pocket 4K and on my Ursa G2. All the mounts are just really loose, and really when that becomes a big problem is if you're using a lens that has kind of a stiffer focus throw. That'll kind of shift the lens, and you'll kind of see that if the lens isn't secured to a rail system. So yeah, I just wish the EF mount was a little bit more secure, or maybe I don't think they could have given us an RF mount because of licensing or something like that. But I don't hate the fact that it's an EF mount. Just wish it was a better mount, or maybe a locking EF mount or something like that. And then the last thing is, I wish they would have, this quarter 20 here thread on top. I don't really care that there's not a bunch of quarter 20s all around, but this one on the top, I wish it was more reinforced to the body so you could actually use a top handle or something without having to need to put a cage or something around it. Because right now, the only thing I really do is I'll put a cold shoe mount here just to run a microphone on top, and for that it's fine. But if I were ever to want to use a top handle, especially to run this on an easy rig like a Mini Max or something like that, this top quarter 20 mount is just not strong enough. It's not recommended to use it for that. So I really wish they would have considered like building this into the frame of the body or something to make it a little bit more robust. From a hardware perspective, those are the missed opportunities that I have found with this camera, but there are some firmware, maybe firmware related improvements that we could see. And the first one is proxy recording, or backup recording, whatever you want to call it. Now we have two card slots here. We have the CFast and the SD card, but right now you can't record simultaneously to both card slots. And I would love to be able to record 6K Blackmagic RAW to one of these, and then to be able to record proxies to the other one, maybe even just a 1080p ProRes proxy file, just something to at least have a backup or anything, or be able to record, I don't know, just something to be able to record a backup file on camera. Because the only way to really get backup files right now is to run this through HDMI to like an external recorder or something like that. And I like to have these cameras as compact as possible, and having the ability to record proxies would just be such a game changer in this camera. Now that we have Gen 5 color, we could record the proxies in Gen 5 color, but anyways, proxy recording would be such a huge bonus to this camera. All right, the next step has to do with frame rates, especially in the 4K Blackmagic RAW windowed mode. So right now, we don't really have, there's not really a use for the DCI 4K RAW right now. The only reason I could maybe see it is if you ran out of card space on your CFast cards and all you have left are SD cards, and you want to just record like 12 to run Blackmagic RAW. For whatever reason, you could use the SD card. That's really the only scenario where I would maybe see me using this. You notice I never mentioned the USB because I do not think that's a secure enough connection to use recording. I don't feel comfortable with it, but your mileage may vary. But right now, the 4K DCI window mode is not really all that useful. It's a pretty decent crop on the camera, and I see no benefit of using that over 6K. But if they gave us higher frame rates in 4K, kind of like we do see on like the DSMC2 cameras and stuff, where it crops in the sensor, we get a little higher frame rates, that'd be really awesome. So maybe we could get like 4K DCI 75 frames per second in the windowed mode, and then if we get like a 240, 241 crop ratio like we can in 6K, but if we get that in 4K, maybe we could get 4K 120p or something like that in the 240 aspect ratio. Now they've done this before, like on the Blackmagic, the Pocket 4K, they gave us a firmware update and they gave us the crop bars and gave us 75 frames per second. So maybe that's something that they can incorporate here onto this camera as well in the 4K crop or 4K window mode and all that kind of stuff. Next up has to do with playback. Playback has always kind of been my biggest gripe with Blackmagic cameras. You have to be in the resolution that you shot in to play a clip back. So if you shot some stuff in 4K RAW and then some stuff in 2.8K to get higher frame rates or whatever, you have to go and set that record mode first to play back the clip that you shot that in. I just wish that you could hit the play button and then different folders would pop up with the different resolutions or something, and then maybe another folder for the stills that you took, the Cinema D&G stills that you took, a way to just play all that back within the menu system without having to navigate through whichever resolution you shot in. Hope that makes sense. It's kind of annoying that you can't just see all the clips played back as opposed to having to go through all the, anyway, you get the point. Next up is all these buttons. Like I never use these buttons at all. And like even these two buttons, like I never use these buttons either. I wish there's a way to custom map these buttons to whatever function that you want to be able to do, to be able to toggle on different exposure tools or all that stuff instead of just these 3 function buttons. I would love to be able to map these other buttons to whatever I want in the camera. And lastly, a little improvement I would like to see has to do with the histogram, the little RGB histogram that we have. We have these little color channel clipping indicators or like traffic lights that you kind of may be familiar with on DSMC2 cameras. But I would love to see, instead of just highlight clipping, I'd love to see a shadow clipping traffic light or clipping indicator or whatever as well, so we can kind of see both ends of the spectrum as opposed to just highlights. I still use false color a lot on the camera, which is awesome, it's built in. But for run and gun stuff where you're just kind of running with the camera and you don't necessarily have the ability or don't want to toggle false color on or off, if you could just reference that little RGB histogram with shadow and highlights clipping, it would be extremely useful to have, especially for run and gun style shooting. All right, so let's wrap this up. I have rambled on. This review is all over the place, but whatever. This camera is a fantastic camera. It is a fantastic offering from Blackmagic Design, and I think it is worthy of the $500 premium that they put over the original 6K. I'm actually surprised that it wasn't even more expensive with everything that they packed into this camera. Now, one thing you need to consider is with the internal NDs, I just showed you that there are definitely still color shifts that you get with the NDs, and as well, you also have some pretty bad IR contamination with this camera. So that's something that you have to consider, and you just have to look at, see if that's something that's important to you to use different NDs or something like that. It is easily correctable in post, but your workflow may not warrant that, and you may not want to have to deal with that in post. That's something that you have to consider. So for me, I love this camera. It's a great B cam to my Ursa G2 or even to the Ursa 12K or something like that. But it's also just a fantastic little travel camera. It packs down really small. You can go into crowds and film in areas where having a bigger like cinema camera like the Ursa or a Red or Ari or something just wouldn't make sense. This thing gets fantastic images without drawing too much attention to yourself. So the $1 million question, or I guess the $2,500 question is, should you buy this camera? Well, I am not one to go tell you what to go do with your money. Your hard-earned money is your money to do with what you want. But my recommendation would be to look at all the features that are in this camera and just see if all these features fit your workflow. And if you're on the fence about it, or if you kind of want to see, instead of buying it, go out and rent one. They're pretty affordable to rent. They're probably like, I haven't looked it up, but I'm sure they're like maybe $100 a day to rent, maybe $80 a day to rent. And just rent it for a couple of days and see if it fits into your workflow. So yeah, my best advice, evaluate all the different features in this camera to see if it fits your workflow. For me personally, it fit perfectly into my workflow as a B cam to my Ursa, as a gimbal cam for B-roll, for travel, all that kind of stuff. And it checks all those boxes perfectly for me. So that's pretty much all we're going to talk about in this video. I'm sure this video is like 7 hours long, and if that's the case, I'm really sorry. And if you're still here, then you freaking rock to stick with me for that long. But I'm gonna wrap this up now. If you have any questions about this camera, let me know down in the comments below. I'll try to answer them as best as I can. If you're having like technical issues with the camera, I would just go ahead and go straight to Blackmagic Design customer support, because I am not a tech advisor for this camera. So, but yeah, hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you found some of these tests helpful and all that kind of stuff. If you did, hit that thumbs up button. If you wanna, if you're still here and you didn't like this video, like you hung around this long time, like give it a thumbs down. That's totally your call, and I support that. But only if you really do, because the likes are better than the dislikes. But that being said, we're out of here. Thank you so much for checking out this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. Peace.